BaptistNews.com. Vice President JD Vance is getting schooled by theologians over his inverted theology expressed in a January 29th interview on Fox News. So this is being called the Ordo Amoris, or the Order of Love. So who should you love first and foremost? Your family, and then your neighbor, and then people in China? Or like, what's the order of our love? So here's the comment by JD Vance, the new vice president. He said, there's this old school, and I think it's a very Christian concept, by the way, that you love your family, and then you love your neighbor, and then you love your community, and then you love your fellow citizens in your own country, and then after that you can focus and prioritize the rest of the world. So his argument seems to be that this is a Christian idea, that you love your family first, you have a responsibility to them first, then your next door neighbor, and it's about proximity. It's kind of it goes out from there. So the people that you know and live with, your family is number one, and then your neighbor number two, and it kind of goes out from there, your own country, and then people in other countries. And when I heard this, I just thought, well, this is kind of just common sense. But he did make the claim that this is biblical, so we want to try to figure out what are some Bible verses, some biblical concepts. Is this biblical or is it not? So one theologian, I guess he's a theologian, he said this, a guy named Zach L. We'll just call him that. He says it's important to point out that this, what JD Vance says, is the exact opposite of what Jesus teaches. In the Sermon on the Mount, which is 3 chapters, he gives no specifics. And it's the exact opposite of what Jesus teaches based on the parable of the Good Samaritan. So that's a little more specific. So let's turn to Luke chapter 10. We'll look at the parable of the Good Samaritan. And we'll see if the parable of the Good Samaritan contradicts what J.D. Vance said. But there was another guy, I think this other guy was a theologian. He said J.D. Vance is completely wrong. It's the opposite of what Jesus taught. He said if you have your child here and a complete stranger, another child here, and you can only save one of their lives, the Christian thing to do is not to save your own child's life, it's to save the complete stranger's life. That's what Jesus taught. He said if you don't like that, that's fine, but just admit you're not ready to pick up your cross and follow Christ. So you should let your own child die in favor of saving the complete stranger. That's what Jesus taught. Listen, I'm just going to say it. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Okay, I would say that's actually evil. You know, this term gaslighting, where people say things that are obviously not true, but they're trying to convince you that something absurd is actually real. That's what that seems like to me. But it doesn't necessarily mean that J.D. Vance's argument is biblical. But let's look at the parable of the Good Samaritan. And remember, this other theologian is saying that the Good Samaritan contradicts what J.D. Vance says. But is everyone clear on the argument that J.D. Vance is making? Nobody needs clarification on this, Ray?
Most Bible verses I said God is first. Love your God.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's a given. I think he's just talking about humans. Okay. Yeah, I don't think he ever implied that you put your own child above God. But we're just talking about human beings, okay? So the parable of the Good Samaritan, Luke 10, starting in verse 25, says, "And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tested him, saying, 'Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?' And he said to him, 'What is written in the law? What is your rendering of it?' So he answered and said, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself.' And he said to him, 'You have answered rightly. Do this, and you will live.' But he, wanting to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Then Jesus answered and said, and here's the parable, "A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, who stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a certain priest came down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite, when he arrived at the place, came and looked and passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion." And why is this significant? Because the Jews and the Samaritans typically hated each other. That's why this would be significant, that a Samaritan actually stopped to help. So it says in verse 33, "The Samaritan had compassion. So he went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and he set him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. On the next day, when he departed, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said to him, 'Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I come again, I will repay you.' So which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to him who fell among thieves?" And he said, "He who showed mercy on him." Then Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." Okay, so I guess the question is, does that parable of the Good Samaritan teach that we must love the stranger before our own children?
No.
I'm not seeing that. I don't see how you would come to that conclusion. Does it teach that as Americans we have just as much of a duty to people in Ukraine as we do to people in our own hometown? I think that I think you're stretching the parable when you try to make it apply to things like that. What does the parable teach us, though? Love your neighbor as yourself. So do we have a duty to our fellow man? Yes. So just because someone isn't my family member, just because they're not a fellow Christian, just because they're not a fellow American, the way I would apply the Good Samaritan, I don't know. Let's say, and be gracious, I'm just pulling this out of a hat, okay? Let's say there is somebody who's perceived as they don't support immigration. They don't want any immigration to this country. That's kind of their position. That's their attitude. But they find a Mexican immigrant on the side of the road beaten and bloodied. Well, they have a duty, whether they like immigration or not, they have a duty to help that person out and to make sure that they get medical care. And I think most people would do that. Again, maybe that's not the best illustration, but I don't think Christians would pass by somebody who was in need like that. So I'm just not making the connection how this parable is undoing or contradicting what JD Vance had to say. So is his comment biblical? Well, there is one principle that was set down by the Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy 5, verse 8. Here's what the Apostle Paul says. He says, "If anyone does not provide for his own, especially those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." So what's Paul saying? If a man doesn't take care of his own wife and children, he's worse than a heathen. He's worse than an unbeliever. So if you're in a situation like that theologian talked about, where you can either feed your own kid or the kid next door or save your own child's life or the complete stranger, Paul is saying you have a duty to your own children, which again, this is not just biblical. I think it's common sense. Yeah, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. You have a specific duty to your spouse. You have a specific duty to care for your own children. If you don't do that, you're worse than an unbeliever. And now JD Vance was talking, I guess, about the policy of the U.S. government and how we're sending money to help. We're sending billions of dollars to help people in other countries, and yet we have homeless veterans, sleeping under bridges, and we're not helping our own people. And I think that's probably the main argument he was making. But again, this just seems like, without getting too much into that, this just seems like common sense. But to say this is the opposite of what Jesus taught is it's garbage. But obviously a lot of quote-unquote Christians, and the reason I say quote-unquote, if that's really what you believe, again, Paul says you're worse than an unbeliever. So I don't think you're a Christian if you really believe that. Some of these people are probably what they call virtue signaling online, but just to get a rise out of people maybe. But yeah, absolutely absurd. Now, one thing I would say is Jesus did talk about, remember his mother and his brothers came, and he said, okay, your mother and brothers are outside, and they want to speak to you. And he says, who are my mother and who are my brothers? Whoever does the will of God is my mother and my sister and my brother. So there is one point I would make is that fellow Christians, we are, in a sense, closer to fellow believers than we are to unbelieving family, which some people would have a hard time with that. So I do have a closer bond, like this is an eternal family between Christian brothers and sisters, more so than even my own blood relatives. But that doesn't undo your responsibility to your own kids. So I think people just got this mixed up. One theologian, at least there was one guy in this article who was making sense. He said, I agree with what JD Vance says. He said, Christ, our Lord, taught the parable of the Good Samaritan to reveal that our duty to love our neighbor extends to all, which nobody's denying that. Nevertheless, the order of love is not flattened out completely and redistributed to all persons without distinction. For example, as a married man, I have the obligation of love to make sure that my wife's medical care is being met before I do the other 50 women on the same hospital floor. There's a higher love for my wife that is not wrong or selfish. Likewise, I have a higher obligation of love to make sure that my own children are properly cared for above my duty to feed and clothe children in France. Again, it's obvious. So, yeah.
I was just thinking too is some of these people that come out and they just, whatever JD Vance was to say, or President Trump was to say, they're going to flip it on.
Right.
They just can't stand it whenever they speak. And, they just kind of,
Yeah.
their
Right.
sensibilities,
Right.
they just can't help themselves.
Yeah, I mean, like you hear what he said. Whatever Donald Trump or JD Vance says, there will be people who automatically take the opposite position just because. And I'm not siding with JD Vance because, well, he's on my team, so therefore I think he's truly correct. Trust me, like I said, he's Roman Catholic, and if he said something that was unbiblical, I'd be talking about that. But I do agree with him here. So this is the whole purpose of this class, in case somebody's new or somebody new watching online. The whole purpose of current events, to talk about relevant issues and to learn how to think biblically, because we're encountering all sorts of ideas like this. We hear things, encounter things every day, and we want to figure out what does the Bible say about all of these different things.